Welcome to the University of Texas at El Paso and to our symposium series. This is number 6 out of 9. My name is Victor Manjarrez, and I am the principal investigator or the project director for this particular project, the symposium series. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the symposium series and how we actually came up with this topic and the topics in the past or the future, or the ones we'll have in the future. This symposium series is actually made possible by the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Office of University Programs. So it's a grant that goes through Borders, Trade, and Immigration Institute out of the University of Houston. So we're very proud to be associated with both entities to allow us to deliver this, a symposium. The idea behind the symposium series is actually to provide, in some sense, a little bit of workforce development. It's not so much training, but it's what I would call professional development. Introduce you to maybe to some concepts and some notions that maybe not have considered in the past on that, and bring some, obviously, hopefully being interesting and bringing some value to maybe how you do your duties now, how you may do your duties in the future. All these in the room, if you were to look around, there's different terms of ranks on that. You'll see from, I would say a line agent to a police officer, first line, second line, supervisors, things of that nature. So the idea is to help provide, develop, or I should say develop, but kind of prod you a little bit to look at different concepts, different ideas, maybe different ways of looking at a problem on that. Now, when you look at the Homeland Security enterprise, it's a risk-based approach from the department to all the entities to even to law enforcement. And when you look at risk, you're really looking at a combination of threats and vulnerabilities on that. So when this topic came up, and this topic came up through a group that I host, it is a Homeland Security Advisory Board. And this advisory board is composed of membership from the Border Patrol, Office of Field Operations, TSA, Enforcement and Removal Operations, ERO, the Sheriff's Office, and the Police Department. So folks come back and they help me, and Secret Service on that. So we talk about different concepts, different ideas, and quite honestly, when I ask them, what are you interested in? On that, they were very much like me before I retired from government service. I shrugged my shoulders. I don't know what the realm of possibility is on that. So what I attempt to do, part of my duty is I learn about research interests around the university, and then say, hey, how does that apply to law enforcement? How does that apply to the Homeland Security enterprise? On that, so I'll bring up these topics to my advisory board and say, what would you think of this? And so this particular symposium was developed about 4.5 to 5 months ago. The idea, they brought it up because, man, that would be really interesting to hear about. On that, so we go through the process. Part of my grant allows me to start looking for the subject matter expertise, the research expertise that is doing this stuff, and the interest on that, which led me, and I'll introduce you to the 3 presenters. On that, they have vast experience in, adversarial reasoning and game theory in the Homeland Security enterprise domain. Our first speaker is Dr. Christopher Kekenville from the University of Texas El Paso. You'll see from his research brief, his interest is in multi-agent systems, looking at, what's the bad guy doing, adversarial reasoning, game theory. He's done some work for the Federal Air Marshals and TSA. And that's what we're very proud to have Dr. Kekenville. Thank you, sir. Dr. Jun Zhang, you're kind, from the University of Buffalo. Also has done some extensive work with the Department of Homeland Security regarding of gaming certain things. And I think you'll see some, I had the opportunity to look at the PowerPoint presentation. There's certain very unique things on there that I had never considered before, or things that we have considered but never really put a lot of thought because we didn't understand those topics on that. So thank you for being here, Dr. Zhang. And then our third speaker is Dr. Anush Sinha from the University of Michigan, as well, very well published in terms of this field and funded from the Department of Homeland Security. If my understanding is correct, all 3 have a tie with the University of Southern California, right? Is that correct? 2 of us. Okay, 2 on that.
Collaborated with.
On that, so there, and I bring that up because University of Southern California It's probably one of those first universities that started looking at that type of work with Dr. Melinda Atombi, his photo that's up here. So with that, Dr. Kickermill, please.
And was there a microphone that I needed to use?
It's already on your set.
It's all set.
Yeah, it's all set.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, to all of you for being here. It's a really great event to be able to interact with this community, and thank you to Victor for setting this whole symposium series up. And thank you also to June and Aranesh for traveling to be here. So I'm Chris Keegan-Bell. So I'm here at the University of Texas El Paso in the Computer Science Department. And so I'm going to be talking today a little bit in the first part of my talk, giving a general overview of some of the kinds of basic techniques that we can use to model security decisions using this technique that we call game theory. I'll tell you a little bit about what that means. Before I get started, though, I did want to acknowledge that this is actually going to be work that I've been pursuing in coordination with a lot of collaborators. Victor mentioned Melinda Atombi. So Melinda was my postdoctoral advisor. I worked at University of Southern California for 2 years before coming here. And they were really one of the first groups that was leading the charge in taking game theory and applying it to the real world, and particularly these kinds of security decision-making problems. You can see a couple of groups here. So there's also a lot of students and other faculty from other institutions who have collaborated on many of these projects. So keep in mind that this is really a group effort. And we've also had a lot of fantastic collaborators from different agencies who have been deeply involved in a lot of these projects that we're going to talk about. Okay. So my background is in artificial intelligence, and specifically multi-agent systems, which are systems where you have more than one decision maker. Okay. And a large part of our research agenda is about improving the way that we can make decisions and how we can justify the ways that we are making those decisions. And this can include a couple of different directions. So one is what we think of maybe as the traditional goal of artificial intelligence, which is designing automated intelligent agents. The one that's more relevant for this conversation is a related goal of developing decision support tools. So these are systems where you have a computer system working in coordination with a human, and they're collaborating to try to make the best possible decisions. And we can get the best of both worlds. We can get the things that humans are good at and the things that computers are good at brought together. There are a lot of interesting challenges to us as researchers in how to do this well, how to model problems effectively, how to handle the uncertainties that arise, how do we develop scalable algorithms. As a computer scientist, that's near and dear to my heart. We'll try not to get into too much of the technical detail, because I know many of you probably don't get quite as excited about the theoretical complexity, results and things that we do. But we will talk a little bit about some of the basic challenges that we address. Multiple agents, we have multiple decision makers. That adds a lot of interesting complexities, and also learning and adapting over time. And we'll address these challenges at various points throughout the day. So one of our main tools in the toolkit that we're going to talk about is something that we call game theory. Okay? And many of my students get very excited when I talk about game theory, because they think we're talking about video games and we're just going to spend our entire class just playing Call of Duty or something. So it's not entirely unrelated, but when we talk about game theory in this context, we mean something a little bit more specific. So really focusing on the strategy aspect and thinking about the decision-making component. So there are several main components of a game. So we talk about games. One of the things that we talk about is the players. So who are the people who are making decisions in the game? We talk about the rules of the game, right? So this includes what actions the players are allowed to take, what strategies they have, perhaps how they interact, the order of interactions, and so forth. Then there are going to be consequences. We also talk about these as utilities or payoffs. So those are going to be, given the choices that the players make, how much do the players value or prefer the different outcomes that can arise. And so we map those into specific numbers that allow us to reason about how good different outcomes are. So there are many examples of different types of problems that we can model as games. So there's a few of them. Some of them are things that we may more traditionally think about as games, so things like chess or perhaps poker. Those are standard kind of games that we play as humans. They help us to think about strategic reasoning, but they're also fun and entertaining. There's other things that we don't necessarily typically think of as games that we can also model theoretically as games. And that includes things like auctions. Here I have an example of a Google search algorithm. So they're very, use a lot of game theory to try to design optimal search auctions. And the one that we're going to focus on today is security problems, security decision making. So there are many different types of security problems that we can think about as games, but one of the very typical ones is what we think of as a resource allocation challenge. And this comes up time and time again across many different types of security challenges. We very often have a lot of things, a lot of space, a lot of area, a lot of potential targets that we need to protect, and we have limited resources that we need to use to protect those targets. And that raises one of the fundamental questions that we think about, which is how are we going to assign limited resources to defend a large space of targets. And this is a problem that we address using this area of research that we call security games. And over the last 10 years or so, myself in collaboration with all these folks that I mentioned on the first slide, especially the Team Core group at the University of Southern California, have been using this idea of taking game theory to analyze decisions and applying it to real-world security domains, working with a number of different agencies to deploy decision support applications to help support their missions. So we're going to go into a number of these cases in more depth. We won't have time to touch on all of them, and there will be some that are not shown here. But I wanted to highlight a couple of different applications just to give you some initial motivation. So the first one that's listed here is a project that we have with the United States Coast Guard, resulted in the application that we call Protect, which helps them with decision making for how they do their patrolling in the maritime environment. The first case study was in the port of Boston, and since then they've been expanding to some other ports as well. It helps with them in scheduling the kinds of patrols that they do, the kinds of activities that they do on those patrols, and so forth. The next line here shows work that we've done with the Transportation Security Agency, the Federal Air Marshals looking at aviation security, includes both security at the airports as well as with the Air Marshals, scheduling the Air Marshals for in-flight security. Third line, we did some work with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department on the metro train security and on enforcing fare evasion kinds of problems. So there they were doing patrolling for the metro lines in Los Angeles. And again, this is helping with allocating those patrols, deciding when and where they're going to patrol on those rail lines. And one of the more recent applications that we've been studying is centered around what we call green security, environmental crime kinds of applications. And these are situations where you're trying to patrol, to detect poaching, to deter poaching, illegal forestry, illegal fishing, and so forth. So all of these are different kinds of problems where we have limited resources and we want to do some smarter way of allocating and using those resources to maximize the security objective. So let me go a little bit further into one of the original applications. So this was the starting point for a lot of this work. This is a system called ARMOR for Assistant for Randomized Monitoring Over Routes. Had some students spend a lot of time working on developing good acronyms, because if you have a good acronym, it really helps to sell the project. So this is a software system that has been deployed continuously at the Los Angeles International Airport since August of 2007. It started with conversations with the airport police and the USC researchers about the different kinds of problems that they had related to resource allocation. We came up with 2 types of problems that they were interested in. So the first is the armor checkpoint system. So the problem here is that you have, you're trying to use checkpoints to expand the security perimeter of the airport, particularly addressing threats like vehicle-borne explosives. So they have checkpoints that they operate on the routes that are going into the airport. There are several of them at LAX, so they only have a certain number of, it takes a lot of resources to set up and operate one of these checkpoints, so they do not have checkpoints continuously on all of these inbound roads. So the question was, when and where should we place the checkpoints to maximize their effectiveness? The armor canine system over here. So this was related to scheduling canine explosives detection units patrolling individual terminals, individual floors at the different terminals at LAX. So LAX has 8 different terminals. You have different floors for the inbound and incoming traffic. And again, there's a limited number of these teams that are available, and the basic question is, well, how do we schedule them? Which terminals should we put them in? And so forth. So this led to the creation of a decision support tool. This is actually the first prototype that was developed by our the graduate students at USC working on this project with Malind. And so it's a pretty simple interface. And this is what the actual LAWA police would use to generate their schedules. So they would, this is the K9 system, so they would, for a particular week, they would say for the morning and the evening, how many teams do we have available to do patrols? And then there's some information that's used to do risk assessments for the different terminals behind the scenes. And they would select the time period that they wanted to do scheduling for, click a button, and it would do the analysis behind the scenes and generate a schedule for how to do the patrols. Okay, so it's a fairly easy system to use, but there's quite a bit going on behind the scenes, and that's what we'll be focusing on next. So when we think about these kinds of scheduling problems, there are several key issues that come up. So the first thing that we think about is the fact that we have intelligent, adaptive attackers. Okay? And this is the real strength of game theory, is the idea that we were going to be able to model the fact that attackers are going to be looking at what we're doing, looking at the security policies, doing surveillance and monitoring, and then responding to whatever security policies are used. Right? And this, again, happens across many different kinds of domains. And this leads us to the idea that our schedules need to be unpredictable, right? If we're always doing repeatable patterns, if we are always setting up a checkpoint, for example, on Monday morning on this road, and we never set up a checkpoint on a different road on Monday morning, then that's a pretty easy pattern to be able to detect by somebody who's doing surveillance and to exploit in planning an attack. So we want our schedules to be unpredictable. We also have diversity in the potential targets. So there's different kinds of consequences and different kinds of vulnerabilities. So in the airport context that we're thinking about for armor, LAX has many different terminals, and these terminals have very different properties. Some of them are primarily focused on cargo aircraft, for example. Then you have the international terminals that have a lot more traffic and aircraft departing to different destinations all around the world. So we need to think about these targets and the consequences and vulnerabilities of them differently. So this is going to lead us to think about how to weight resources, how to place them weighted towards the more important targets, the higher consequence targets, more often than the less vulnerable or lower consequence kinds of targets. So So it's not going to be sufficient just to do a uniform, an even randomized kind of schedule. We're going to need to think about how to intelligently be unpredictable in these kinds of scheduling problems. The last major issue that came up is uncertainty about attackers. There can be multiple groups that have different kinds of capabilities, and they may have, we have uncertainty about the kinds of motivations and preferences that these attackers may have. And this is going to lead us to thinking about modeling that kind of uncertainty and using what we call Bayesian reasoning in our game models. Okay. All right, so this is leading up to thinking about how we can use game theory to model these kinds of scheduling problems. I'm going to start off with a couple of fundamental concepts. Some of you may have encountered some of these things before, some perhaps not. So I've been teaching a course this semester actually in using game theory for doing risk analysis, especially in focusing on cybersecurity kinds of issues. I'll tell you that the next 3 slides we spend about 2 months covering introduction to utility theory and probability theory, decision theory. So I'm kind of compressing a lot of material down and just giving the very high level idea here. So the first thing that we need to understand a little bit about is what we mean by utilities or payoffs. And utilities or payoffs is how we measure the magnitude of different kinds of preferences in a decision-making scenario. So we need to have a way of talking about how good or how bad are different outcomes or different situations that could arise. And when we talk about a utility or payoff function, what that does is it maps every possible outcome into a real number, which we use to measure the value. And you might wonder why we actually use numbers to measure these values. It turns out that we can actually go back to even a more fundamental representation where we have preferences, and we just have an ordering and say, I prefer this situation to this situation. And if we have some notion of rational preferences which are reasonable in certain ways, it turns out that there's a lot of theory that says that rational preferences are going to be associated with utility functions or can be represented by utility functions. So this is a tool that we very often use to try to capture how good different outcomes are. And that allows us to think about decision making, because the whole point of decision making is that we want to get to outcomes that we prefer, goals that we want to achieve, and so forth. Another fundamental concept that we're going to rely on a lot is probabilities. So there's a whole theory built up around probabilities. And it's really about characterizing risk and uncertainty. Okay? So fundamentally, a probability measures the likelihood of an event. Right? It's just a ratio between the number of times an event occurs compared to the number of times you run a trial. Right? So if we roll a die, what is the likelihood that we're going to roll a 2? Well, there's 6 possibilities, and one of those 6 cases is a 2. So the overall probability of that is the ratio of those 2 things, 1/6, and so forth, right? And if we actually ran that experiment, and if we have a fair die and we roll it many, many times, as we roll it a large number of times, on average, we're going to roll 1/6 of the time a 2. Okay? And actually, the birth of probability theory was thinking about exactly these kinds of questions. People were gambling and playing card games and dice games and wanted to understand how these games worked. So they started to develop the mathematics of probability theory to help them reason about these games. And today it's used in all kinds of contexts where we have uncertainty or risk that we need to think about. Okay. There are a number of fundamental reasons of different sorts that we can have uncertainty that we need to address. So one is basic ignorance or incomplete knowledge, right? So there can be, we don't know for sure what the weather is going to be tomorrow. It could rain, it could be sunny, it could be cloudy. We fundamentally don't know that, so we could express our uncertainty about that using probabilities. There's a 20% chance that it's going to be cloudy tomorrow, for example. Another interesting reason is complexity, or our own sort of laziness in evaluating very complex scenarios. So this comes up in situations where we have very, very complex decisions that we have to make. I often use the example of chess, right? Where in principle in chess there's no uncertainty, there's no unknown information. The board states everything is known. The problem is that the game is so complex that we can't reason about all of the possible ways that that game might play out. And so we often have to think about what is the likelihood that my opponent might make certain moves, and we can capture that using probabilities, and that allows us to think about these complex scenarios without reasoning about every possible situation. The last one is going to be particularly interesting for today, and that is strategic unpredictability. So very often in these games, we're going to be taking actions that we want to be unpredictable, and we're going to be representing how often we take those kinds of actions using probabilities. Okay? If we have poker players in the room, you know that one of the elements of a good poker strategy is bluffing, right? Sometimes you have to bluff. You have to make a large bet with a bad hand that represents that you have a good hand, and the reason that you have to do that is to keep your opponent guessing in some sense, right? They have to be uncertain about whether you have a good hand or not, and if you only ever bet with a great hand, then anytime you bet against that opponent, they're going to know everything that you've got, right? So you have to be unpredictable sometimes in your strategies in order to keep your opponents guessing. Another game that most people are familiar with is Rochambeau or rock, paper, scissors, right? So this is the basic game that we often play to make decisions. Select rock, paper, scissors. And that's another game where you have to randomize to be effective at playing that game, right? You can't be the player that always chooses rock and you get a reputation for always choosing rock, because then you can be defeated, right? If I know you're always going to play rock, then I'm going to play paper. So unpredictability is a fundamental part of thinking about how to play many of these games. And that's going to be very important in the kinds of security games that we talk about. Probability theory also gives us a very valuable tool for reasoning about evidence called Bayes' rule. And that's one of the standard ways we have of thinking about how you can rationally update your beliefs when you get new evidence or new observations about something. I'm not going to go into the details, but we do have that tool available to us from probability theory, and we make use of that in some of our game models. So once we have utility theory, we have a notion of which outcomes we prefer, and we have probability theory to allow us to talk about uncertainty in ways that we, magnitudes of different risks, how likely different events are. We can combine those into what we call decision theory. And decision theory is a way of thinking about formal ways of making decisions. And there are many kinds of decision rules or decision criteria that are introduced. Probably the best known is the notion of maximizing the expected value of something. So this is maximizing the value on average in some sense, right? So I have multiple different kinds of events that can occur with different likelihoods, and I want to maximize my average payoff. Okay? The way that you would calculate an expected value is you look at, say that we had two different events that could happen. One occurs 25% of the time, one occurs 75% of the time, and then we have the values of those two events. The first one gives me $10, and the second one gives me $5, right? So I would multiply the probability times the value for each of those events, and then sum them up. Okay. And the principle of maximizing expected value just says that we're going to calculate the expected value for any action or course of action that we could take, and choose the one that gives us the highest value. Okay. That kind of principle assumes what we call risk neutrality, so it assumes that we're not risk averse, so that we're willing to try to maximize the average payoff. There are concepts that allow you to specify risk aversion, so you'd like a more certain outcome rather than something that's more unpredictable. An extreme form of that is what we call the max-min value. So this is a solution concept that is representing a sort of paranoid decision maker where everything is out to get you and you want to maximize your worst case outcome, right? What is the worst thing that could happen? I want to take an action that mitigates that as much as possible, okay? So that is another concept that we can talk about. The trade-off is that in some contexts you may give up a lot of your utility in expectation or in the typical situation to guard against these worst-case outcomes. Interestingly, in very adversarial situations where you are making decisions against somebody who's really, whose utilities are very opposed to yours, these two concepts actually lead you to the same kinds of solutions. So this actually happens a lot in security where really you need to be paranoid, right? The right thing to do, they are out to get you, and you want to really maximize that worst case outcome. Another type of solution concept that comes up a lot is what we call regret. And this is actually a concept which is a bit more backwards looking. It looks at opportunity loss and basically asks the question, after we see what happens, could I have done better, right? So that would be what we think about as a regret, right? Looking backwards, I wish I had done this instead of this. And how much better could I have done if I had done that? So we can actually come up with solutions that try to look ahead and minimize the potential regret that we could have in the future. And it's related to these other concepts, but it sometimes leads you to slightly different answers about which actions you can take. So these are some of the common ones. There are other decision rules that we can come up with and that have been analyzed and studied in the literature. But this gives you a sense that there are some different, a diversity of concepts that we can apply once we have these decision-making problems specified in a sort of formal way. So the last question here, so what if there are multiple decision makers, right? So we have, we can make decisions for a single player, sort of acting perhaps against nature or some fundamental uncertainty. If there are multiple decision makers, that's where we get into this world of game theory and adversarial reasoning. So the difference between game theory and adversarial reasoning, game theory is quite general. It talks about all situations where we have multiple decision makers, including situations where the goals are aligned and agents are trying to cooperate, as well as situations where you have agents whose interests are opposed, right? And that's an adversarial situation. We'll sometimes in game theory talk about zero-sum games. That means whatever one agent wins, another agent has to lose. And that's the most adversarial situation you can be in. There's a whole spectrum of games that span the spectrum from purely cooperative games all the way to purely adversarial games. And of course, in security games, we're usually more on the spectrum of adversarial situations. We're thinking about attackers and defenders, and usually their interests are, if not perfectly opposed, close to perfectly opposed. So game theory is going to give us tools to think about decisions with multiple decision makers. The interesting thing about games as opposed to individual decisions is that now my best decision as a decision maker in this game may depend on what somebody else chooses to do. Okay? And that means that to try to make the best decision in a game, I may have to make some sort of prediction about what another intelligent person is going to do. And I could try to think about what their goals and objectives might be and use that as a way to try to predict what they might actually do. So let me now introduce you to a pretty simple example of what we would call a security game. This is going to be be a relatively simple game, but it will give you a basic notion of what the elements of these games are. So we're going to think about a game here that has 2 players, and those 2 players are going to represent a defender and an attacker, generically. There's going to be 2 targets in this game. So of course, in general, we may have many more, but this allows us to write down a pretty simple representation of this game. So I've written down a matrix. So our 2 players are going to be choosing one of these 2 targets, but the meaning is a little bit different. So say here that we have 1 defender resource. So this is 1 patrol unit or 1 officer, and the defender here is going to have a choice of assigning that defensive resource to protect either target 1 or target 2. Okay? Can't protect both at the same time. Today I'm going to protect target 1. The attacker's choice is which target to attack. And again, this is going to be either target 1 or target 2. Okay, so here we have definition of what the players are and what the actions or the strategies are in this game. We still need to say something about the utilities or what the consequences are, and that's what gets written in this matrix. So this is a standard form that we call the normal form or a matrix game. It's often used to represent these sort of simple games. And the way that you can interpret this is, so we have a combination of actions here. So player 1, defender in this case, chooses target 1. Player 2 chooses target 1. This is the outcome that happens, and these are the payoffs or utilities for the players. And by convention, we write the payoff for the row player, the defender, first, and the payoff for the column player second. So the values here represent that if the defender chooses target 1 and protects that, the defender gets a value of 1, and if the attacker chooses to attack that target, so he's choosing to attack the target which is being actively protected, the attacker gets a payoff of -1. And we can fill in payoffs for the rest of these combinations of choices. Of course, we could have different numbers in the matrix depending on different assessments for the values of these targets. We can see here that the magnitudes are a little bit higher for target 2, so that would reflect that target 2 is perhaps a more valuable or higher consequence target. You can also see, so the structure of the game here is that if the defender chooses to protect target 1 and the other target gets attacked, so now the defender gets a negative payoff, a payoff of -2, and the attacker is getting the positive payoff of 2, right? So basically the attackers would prefer to attack the highest value targets they can, but also targets that are not being protected. And the defender is going to do better if they are defending targets that the attacker chooses to attack. Okay. And so the idea is that, so this would be considered a simultaneous move game. You can think about different orderings of moves, but by default, we think about this as simultaneous move, which means that the players are going to make their choices without knowing what choice the other player has made, right? So you have 2 players, and each of them is going to choose either target 1 or target 2. You reveal your choice, and then you figure out which payoffs you received. Okay. All right, so now we're going to try a brief audience participation moment. So I want you to actually try playing this game to get a sense of how you would have to think about playing this game. Okay? So I want you to find a couple of partners, play this game a few times with different people, make some friends. So what you're going to have to do is look at this game. You're going to have to decide who's going to play the role of the attacker and who's going to play the role of the defender. And then you've each got to think about it and decide whether you're going to choose target 1 or target 2. You choose 1 finger or 2 fingers, perhaps, behind your back without showing the other player. Then reveal your choice and figure out who actually gets which payoffs in this game. Okay? I do this to my students all the time, so good way to wake you up. Any observations from your play? Anything that you were thinking about or observed as you were playing this game?
I can kick you just like a class, right? Complete silence?
Complete silence. Well, I can wait in silence for a while.
The general desire to maximize reward or prevent the catastrophic scenario.
Yeah, so these are the kinds of things you're thinking about. So so maximizing a reward, though, depends, in this case, on what the other player does, right? So that's the way the game is set up. So I can tell you a little bit about how we think about these using tools of game theory. One thing is a best response. Okay? So the idea of a best response is, so if I predict what my other opponent is going to do, so let's say in this case that as the attacker, I predict that the defender is going to defend target 1. Okay? Then I can think about what is my best response or my best choice, and the analysis is, I can either choose target 1 and get -1, or I can choose target 2 and get 2, right? So between those two choices, the choice would be kind of obvious, and the attacker's best response to the action, target 1 for the defender, would be to choose target 2. Go where they're not. On the other hand, if the prediction was that the defender was going to use target 2, I get either 1 or -1. So the best response in that case would be to choose target 1. Okay? So again, this shows that the best option depends on what the opponent does. It depends on my prediction about what they are likely to do. So this is what we call a pure strategy best response, because we're predicting one of the specific actions. As I mentioned, one of the fundamental things that we want to think about is unpredictability and probabilities of playing different actions. And a game theory of this notion called a mixed strategy that allows us to talk about the likelihood of playing different actions. So effectively, I can, as a player, I can mentally flip a coin, and I'm not always going to choose 1 or always going to choose 2. I'm going to choose somehow randomly which thing I'm going to do. This would be an example of the coin flip mixed strategy for the defender. Half of the time I go to target 1, half of the time I go to target 2. We can also think about what would be the attacker's best response to a mixed strategy. So now we think about computing the expected payoffs. So in this case, if I choose target 1 as the attacker, half of the time I get a value of 1, and half of the time I get a value of -1, which averages out to 0. Target 2, half of the time as the attacker I get a value of 2, half of the time I get a value of -1, so it averages out to a bit better than 0. Right? So the better strategy for the attacker in response to a 50-50 mixture would be to attack target 2 and get that higher value as often as possible. So this is not the optimal strategy. In game theory, we have this notion of a Nash equilibrium, and the formal definition is a bit technical, but the intuition is that we're going to come up with strategies for both players that are optimizing against the other player's strategy. So there's a simultaneous kind of optimization going on. And then both players are happy playing the strategy that they're playing in this equilibrium if the other player plays it. And there's a number of motivations and reasons why these equilibria are interesting. They tend to be fixed points of learning dynamics and things like that. And they also make sense that they are, in a zero-sum game, in an adversarial situation, this is also the strategy that maximizes your worst-case payoff, is a Nash equilibrium strategy. So it's kind of guarding against that worst-case outcome. If we actually take this game and calculate the Nash equilibrium, it turns out to be a strategy where you have 40% of the time the defender protects target 1, which is kind of the less valuable target. 60% you attack target 2, and the attacker is going to choose target 2 33% of the time, and target 1 67% of the time. Okay? So the players are kind of weighting their strategies. This kind of makes some intuitive sense because the defender is putting more resources towards towards the more valuable target. And that's actually, you can see kind of a deterrence effect because the attacker here is actually being deterred most of the time to attacking the less valuable target instead of the more valuable one, because there's a higher chance of being, of running into defenses at the more valuable targets. Okay. So that's kind of the basic intuition for a simple game. In a lot of the work that we do on security games, we actually use a slightly different solution concept. It turns out in a lot of games that these give you the same solution as a Nash equilibrium, but this one has a lot of nice intuition. It's called a Stackelberg equilibrium. Stackelberg is the name of the person that first came up with this equilibrium concept. And the key reason we were interested in this concept as opposed to a basic Nash equilibrium is that it allows us to model attacker surveillance. So we want to assume sort of a worst case attacker who knows what our security policy is. So this is somebody who has watched and observed perhaps over a period of time and seen how often we place a checkpoint on this road versus this road, how often we have a K9 unit in this terminal versus this terminal. It has an idea of the probabilities that we are using to make those decisions. So the most powerful attacker that we can imagine is one who observes our exact mixed strategy and then is able to optimize to plan an attack based on that knowledge. Okay? So we can think about this as a commitment in some sense. The defender has to, you got to go out there every day and execute your security policy. You don't know when you're being observed and when you're not being observed. So this is a kind of commitment. So they choose this policy first, and then at some point the attacker comes in, observes that 10% of the time you're on this road, 90% of the time you're on the other road, and gets to make a choice then of which target to attack. And we assume that the attackers are rational, intelligent attackers, and that they are going to choose the an optimal target to attack. And then our challenge as the defender, as the decision maker who's trying to figure out how to allocate these resources is, well, what's the best policy that we can come up with here under the assumption that the attacker is going to optimally respond to our policy? Okay? So this is really a kind of worst case analysis. We're assuming intelligent attackers and trying to optimize against that scenario. Okay, so we often think of security games in this sort of canonical form that allows us to think about much larger games in a sort of compact way. And we, in this kind of representation, we have a set of targets. Here we have 3, but it could be much, much larger, maybe hundreds, thousands, even in some kinds of applications, hundreds of thousands or millions. The key information, though, is the payoff information for the 2 players, the defender and the attacker, when this target is attacked. And there are 2 cases that we consider. So there's the reward and the penalty case, which are flipped for the defender and the attacker. So the attacker gets a better payoff if I'm defending this target and it is attacked, compared to if I'm not defending this target and it is attacked, and vice versa for the attackers. So the attackers prefer to attack a target when it is not defended as compared to when it is defended. Okay? So with 4 values, we can represent the utilities, the outcomes that are related to each of these targets. Of course, that's going to depend on an evaluation of the consequences and the risks associated with each of these potential targets. So the defender's strategy then can be reduced to thinking about what is the probability that we want to cover or that we want to assign a protective resource to each of these targets. Again, typically you're going to have limited resources, so you're not going to be able to cover, you're not going to be able to be everywhere all at once. So you've got to make a strategic decision about how much weight am I going to put in my policy to cover each of these different potential targets. In this case, this example, if there were no coverage at all, nothing was nothing was covered, the attacker is going to look at these rewards and say, well, this is the most valuable target, so that's the one that I'm going to choose to attack. Okay? Now, if you start thinking about adding coverage, so if you're the defender, one intuition that we can have is that the first place you're going to start allocating resources to harden against potential attacks is then going to be this target, which is the most likely one to be attacked, right? As you start adding resources to target to protect that target, it's going to make that target gradually less attractive to an attacker, right? Because sometimes when he chooses to attack that target, he's going to get this much lower payoff. Here it's a -3. Okay? And one of the interesting things that we can think about is that the difference between these two payoffs is really, in some sense, a measure of the amount of deterrence effect that we have. So when we start allocating resources to targets, how quickly are they going to become deterred from attacking this target and maybe shift to what is the next best alternative? Okay? And the rate at which that's going to happen depends on the difference between these two values. Okay? So again, it's just to give you some intuition for how these solutions work. So these are the basic kinds of models that we use in applications like Armor and the other applications that have been developed for other domains more recently. There's one additional complication that came up in the development of Armor, which was uncertainty about different types of adversaries. And the intuition is that we may have very different types of attackers who are interested in planning attacks on an airport, ranging from very sophisticated, very well-resourced global terrorist organizations to perhaps disgruntled employees or local gangs or other types of attackers who may have different motivations and may have different capabilities. So one of the things that we built into the system to address that was actually thinking about different types of attackers. So we have here an example of 3 different types of attackers, and we have a notion of the probabilities that we're going to be facing each of these types of attackers. And what we do is we allow, basically we're playing a different game with each of these types of attackers. There's a different payoff matrix, a different utility function that we can represent. So this allows us to represent potentially the different motivations or capabilities. And we can take that and construct what we call a Bayesian game model. Bayesian just means that we're representing these different types and the probabilities, and we end up with a larger, more complex game representation. So algorithmically, that's a challenge for us because we have a larger game to solve. And there was some research that went into trying to figure out how to solve these games quickly enough that we could build them into the application. But it's nice because it allows us to represent some of these additional situations. Later on, I'm going to show you in the afternoon talk some additional information about evaluation and different kinds of tests that have been done, experiments that have been done with these kinds of systems. This is one of the first analyses that was done of the Armor system, and the question was, well, so how much value does this give us? We're trying to intelligently randomize. We're using this game theoretic idea. Is this actually improving our outcomes? So this is one simulation that was run with the real payoff numbers that were calculated for the airport from airport data. We don't talk about exactly how those risk values are calculated, but you can imagine what kind of factors might go in, including passenger traffic and those kinds of things. So this is for the Armor K9 system, and we ran a comparison between using the Armor system with different numbers of K9 patrols, 6 K9s. This line represents 5 K9s, Armor with 3 K9s. And then we compared that against baseline, the unintelligent randomized solution, the dice rolling solution where we just we roll a die, we choose each option with the same fraction of the time, And so we're randomized, we're unpredictable, but we're not intelligently randomized. And these are the games for different days of the week. And this is the defender payoff. So higher is better on this axis. And so what we found was, as you'd expect, if you increase the number of resources that you have available, of course you could do better, right? So that's more resources is always going to allow you to be more effective. But the comparison that was interesting here is between the intelligently randomized cases and the case where it was not intelligently randomized. And even with half of the resources, you were doing better against an optimal attacker, a worst case attacker, than you were with the unweighted, just dice rolling kind of solution. Okay, so that was really an indication that there was something to be gained from doing this kind of more sophisticated modeling and analysis that was going to allow you to make better use of any, whatever level of resources you have available, use them intelligently, optimize the way that they're deployed, and we can really have a measurable impact on the potential security. Mm-hmm.